Mr. Commissioner, thank you for that very enlightening lecture on traditional security threats. I found it interesting that you defined it as such because you also straddled some non-traditional issues when you talked about the non-state actors, particularly transnational actors, terrorism, narco-trafficking, because these are some of the issues that are emerging in the debates on non-traditional threats and human security, threats not just against the state but against the individuals. So I thought that there are avenues there again for convergence in dealing with traditional and non-traditional security threats as it relates to Cuba. Secondly, the issue of invasion. I have actually interacted very closely with Cuban Americans in South Florida. And I don't know if you were talking about an invasion from South Florida or where when you mentioned it. But I don't think from my research that it's going to come from there or that it's going to happen. Well, there have been invaluable lessons to be learned from the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, first of all. But also because of the composition of that community, which is extremely heterogeneous today. And most Cuban Americans, particularly those that came in the latter waves in the 1980s, 1990s, are in for constructive engagement and dialogue rather than invasion. The hardliners are a small minority in South Florida. So maybe when you spoke about invasion, maybe you can clarify exactly where you were talking about. The other issue is the issue of migration. The invasion may not take place for that very reason. Whenever the US government did something to aggravate Castro, he opened the borders, and we know what happened. Mariel Boatlift, 1994, Balsero crisis. So I think they're going to be very careful and very cautious about an invasion. That's probably why it has not happened to this date. The Caribbean, someone was asking between the panels today about whether Cuba is going to need the Caribbean should the embargo be lifted in terms of trade and tourism markets and stuff. And you've raised a very important point about engaging the Caribbean for security reasons, and I'm talking here about traditional security reasons as it converges with non-security. Drug trafficking is going to be a problem, as it is in the Caribbean. Crime, HIV/AIDS, which is going to come with migration and movement, transboundary migrations, transboundary movements. So I thought that was a very interesting point in emphasizing the need that Cuba is going to have for the Caribbean in the future. Thank you.
I'm just curious and wondering if you could say something about the bilingual capability or potential within the police force.
Two short questions. Rear Admiral, you concentrated quite rightly on Jamaican perceptions of security cooperation with Cuba, but I'm wondering if you care to go a little further. I don't know, and to what extent do you have knowledge of Cuban perceptions of security challenges that they may face from their neighbors? For example, how many Jamaicans are in prison in Cuba for drug trafficking? It would be interesting to know. And secondly, what are the relations like between Cuba and the Bahamas or Haiti or the other Caribbean neighbors, and what security issues do they face in those relationships? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ruin. Osvaldo Cardenas. Well, I'm born in Cuba, but I live now in Jamaica. And there are some issues relating to security here. First of all, I would like to say that in Cuba, security is paramount. National security is the center of the Cuban policy. The defense of the revolution against an aggression from the United States have been dominant for the last 50 years. The main leaders of Cuba are military. Cuba is the result of a revolution, and In fact, the president of Cuba is the former chief of the army, General Raúl Castro. So, Cuba and Jamaica and Cuba and their neighbors have very good relations. There have not been great security concerns in regards to Cuban neighbors from the point of view of the Cuban government through years. The relations have been very good, although the coordinations and the joint work in the field of security does not seem to me sufficiently enhancing. It's not as good as it should be. Those relations are basically bilateral, but there are very few multilateral relations in this field, meaning that Cuba has a relation with Haiti, has a relation with Jamaica, a relation with Bahamas, has coordination with the United States, but there is very few coordination of all these factors at the same time. This is a feeling I have, and I think that is, maybe I'm wrong. I would like your clarification in this field. The need for a greater coordination at the regional level on these issues of drug trafficking, migration, illegal movement of weapons and people, terrorism, etc. On the other hand, recently there have been some new developments that introduce security threats. One of them is the rising of the new Venezuelan government. There have been several information on the possibility, not of a United States aggression in Cuba, which have been long abandoned, but the possibility of a confrontation, a military confrontation between Venezuela and United States. And Cuba is a close ally of Venezuela. So this introduced new threats in the region. In fact, Venezuela has been purchasing large amounts of weapons from Russia. And this is well known. So the region, unfortunately, is not as calm as it should be. On the other hand, recently, there was a declaration of Russia in regards to the missiles that the United States is trying to set in some former Eastern European countries, saying that they are willing to sell long-range airplanes to Cuba. The long-range airplanes were one of the issues during the missile crisis of 1962. The Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement indicates that missile crisis and missiles and long-range airplanes were going to be removed from Cuba. And all of a sudden, the Russians made this statement. As far as I know, the Cubans hadn't said anything, but this seems to be new development in the security area, and I don't know if you can comment something about this.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll stop at that.